This one starts in the storm-lashed foothills of Montana. A veteran ranger, a wild bobcat clinging to life, and a single decision that breaks all the rules and changes everything. As the floodwaters rise, Ethan must choose. Let nature run its course, or risk everything for a fragile, wild hope. If you've ever wondered where compassion ends and true courage begins, or what it means to respect the wild, even as you reach out a hand, this story is for you. Drop a comment, share your thoughts, and if you want to help me bring more stories of hope and wild connection to life, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps me share even more stories that matter. Let's dive in. There are moments when the world turns on a dime, when the river that's always seemed so steady decides it's time to remind everyone who's really in charge. That spring, Montana's Rocky Mountain foothills had thawed too quickly. By the time the sun rose on the third day of rain, the valley was churning, wild water roaring where cattle once grazed. Trees leaned as if whispering secrets to each other, their roots half drowned, the air smelling sharp and green and electric. Ethan Bailey, a park ranger who'd seen more storms than birthdays he cared to admit, stood on the rim of the ridge, squinting into the silver-gray blur. His truck was parked at an awkward angle on the service road, emergency lights spinning through mist and pine. Every few minutes, the radio on his belt crackled with static. Warnings, updates, frantic calls from locals trapped on higher ground. He'd spent the night ferrying families to safety, boots heavy with mud, eyes burning with fatigue. But it was the call of the wild that made him pause now. Down below, caught between the hunger of the river and the stubbornness of dry land, a log spun crazily in the current. At first, Ethan thought it was just another branch snapped loose by the flood. But then there, a flash of tawny fur, black-tipped ears, muscles taut with terror. An adult bobcat, claws dug deep into bark, riding the log like a last hope. Even at this distance, Ethan could see the animal's eyes, huge, golden, wild, flickering with that primal blend of fear and defiance. The river surged, swallowing rocks, pulling at the log, and the bobcat clung tighter, its body trembling from the cold. Or maybe just the knowledge that nothing in this world was fair or predictable. For a heartbeat, Ethan hesitated. Everything his training had taught him, every pamphlet in the visitor center, every lecture from the Fish and Wildlife Service, echoed in his mind. Observe, don't intervene. Let nature take its course. The wild belongs to itself. But standing there, boots sinking into the spongy moss, he felt the old, stubborn pulse of the land in his veins. When do you step in to help? Even when the wild says, stay away. Where is the line between wisdom and cowardice? Lightning forked somewhere upriver, the sky booming. The log spun closer, Bobcat's haunches bunching for a leap that wouldn't reach anywhere safe. Ethan could see her now, a deep cut along one paw, the fur matted with blood and silt. He felt something twist inside him, that same helplessness he'd felt as a boy when his father's dog was swept away in a storm, the ache of wanting to act but not knowing how. A family of deer leapt past behind him, frantic and silent, their bodies blending into the storm. Above, a hawk circled, wings spread wide, calling out a cry that sounded almost like a warning. The valley had become a stage for nature's indifference, every creature scrambling for its own survival. The bobcat slipped, claws scraping the wet wood, and for a split second, her eyes locked with Ethan's. Not pleading, never that, not from a wild thing, but challenging, daring him. What are you going to do about it, human? Ethan's hand tightened around his radio. He wanted to call for backup, to do the right thing the right way, but the river was rising, seconds counting down. He scanned the bank for any sign of easier rescue, a fallen branch, a rope snagged on the rocks, but the water had swept the world clean. No tools, no time, just instinct and the pounding of his heart in his ears. Downstream, the log lurched, caught on a submerged stump. The bobcat almost lost her grip, scrambling with the last of her strength, her yowl slicing through the storm. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet fur and fear, and Ethan knew. This was it. If he didn't move now, she'd be gone. Another casualty, another story he'd carry in the quiet hours after the rain. He tore off his ranger jacket, tossing it onto the rocks, and vaulted down the slope, boots slipping, hands grabbing at branches. The water was colder than anything he remembered, biting through denim and flesh, stealing the breath from his lungs. The current was faster up close, a living thing with a mind of its own. But Ethan pushed forward, teeth clenched, vision narrowing to the struggling shape ahead. The bobcat saw him, wild eyes narrowing, but she was too spent to run. The log shuddered as Ethan waded out, every step a battle against the pull of the flood. He reached the stump, braced himself, and grabbed for the sodden bark. The bobcat lashed out, claws raking air, but Ethan only murmured, "Easy, easy, girl. I've got you." For a terrifying second, he thought they'd both go under. The log twisted, the water rose, and Ethan's fingers went numb. But then, the bobcat's body sagged, too tired to fight. He gathered her up, muscles straining, cradling her against his chest as the river roared its disapproval. Together, battered and soaked, man and wildcat staggered back toward the shore. The world had shrunk to two beating hearts, and the knowledge that just this once, boundaries had to be broken. And as Ethan collapsed on the bank, gasping for air, the bobcat lay trembling beside him, alive for now, because one human decided to step over the line. But in the wild, nothing is ever simple. The storm still raged. The question hung in the air, heavier than the rain. What would happen next, now that their fates were tangled together? The river did not let go easily. Ethan and the bobcat lay on the muddy bank, the flood roaring so close it seemed to pull at their very breath. Rain hammered the pine needles overhead, and cold crept into Ethan's bones, leaving his hands stiff and useless. He pushed himself upright, wiping water from his eyes, and looked down at the bobcat. She was sprawled beside him, one paw stretched awkwardly, blood mixing with mud around a jagged gash. Her sides heaved, breath coming in shallow, sharp bursts, but her gaze was fixed on Ethan with an intensity that felt almost human. For a split second, he saw not a wild animal, but a fellow survivor, cornered, exhausted, and furious at fate. Protocol screamed in Ethan's mind. Everything about this moment was wrong. Rangers didn't touch wildlife, not unless there was no other option. Training manuals repeated it like a prayer. Keep your distance. Nature's rules are older than any man's, and you mess with them at your own peril. But standing here, with the flood hungrily gnawing away at the valley, Ethan knew this was one of those moments that lived outside the lines. He fumbled for his radio with shaking hands, pressed the call button, and tried to steady his voice. "This is Ranger Bailey. Urgent. I've got a wildcat, injured, stranded, near the North Fork. Requesting wildlife rescue support, stat." The reply crackled through, barely audible over the storm. "Copy, Bailey. Weather's bad. Closest team is over an hour out. Advised to keep distance. Secure your own safety first. Secure your own safety. Ethan looked down at the bobcat, her fur slick with water, whiskers twitching, one ear torn and bleeding. She wasn't going anywhere. The flood had taken that choice from her. He could see her body tremble, whether from cold or pain, he couldn't tell. For a moment he hesitated, shivering, and then shrugged off his soaked flannel shirt, laying it gently over her shaking frame. The bobcat tensed, muscles bunching. Her lips pulled back in a warning snarl, but Ethan just crouched beside her, careful not to touch, and began to speak in a low, steady voice. "It's all right. I know you're scared. We're both stuck out here. I'm just trying to help, okay?" She stared at him, pupils huge and black, breath coming in foggy bursts. Ethan thought about all the times he'd seen animals die, caught on barbed wire, starved in droughts, their stories lost before they even began. He couldn't do it again. Not tonight. Not with the storm raging and the river roaring like a demon at the edge of the world. The wind picked up, branches clattering overhead, and Ethan glanced up, searching for shelter. A fallen pine, its trunk still mostly dry, offered the only haven. He'd have to move her, pick her up, risk those claws and teeth, break every rule in the book. His heart pounded. One mistake and he'd be the one bleeding in the mud. He edged closer, talking all the while. "I know you don't trust me. I wouldn't trust me either. But if we stay here, the river wins." The bobcat's ears flicked, her body taut with uncertainty. Ethan moved slowly, hands open, projecting calm even as adrenaline surged through him. He slid his arms beneath her, feeling the tremor of her muscles, the thrum of her wild heart. For a heartbeat, she froze, every fiber braced for violence. And then, as if making a gamble of her own, she let him lift her. Ethan cradled her against his chest, moving with agonizing slowness toward the shelter of the fallen pine. Her head whipped around once, jaws open in a silent snarl, but she did not strike. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid, frantic, echoing his own. Under the pine's broken branches, he laid her down as gently as he could. She limped away a few paces, then collapsed in a heap, her injured paw stretched out before her. Ethan knelt beside her, breathing hard, rain dripping off his nose. He peeled back the flannel, checking the wound. Blood welled up from the jagged cut. He rummaged in his field pack, hands numb, and pulled out a first aid kit. He hesitated. Bandaging a wild animal's paw was madness. She could tear him open in a second. But as the river thundered by, something passed between them. A thin thread of trust, spun in desperation and pain. Ethan dabbed at the wound with gauze, whispering steady nonsense under his breath. The bobcat shivered, but did not pull away. He wound the bandage around her paw, fingers clumsy, and secured it with a strip of medical tape. The whole time her eyes never left his, watchful, feral, but searching for something. Maybe mercy. Suddenly a branch snapped nearby. Too loud, too close. Ethan spun around, heart hammering, every sense straining. Was it another animal, someone stranded, or just the storm playing tricks? The tension snapped. The bobcat's muscles coiled, and for a moment, Ethan thought she'd bolt. But she only lay there, trembling, exhausted, her breath ragged. He let out a long, shaky sigh and sat back, shoulders pressed against the rough bark of the pine. Above, the sky cracked with thunder. For a few minutes, man and wildcat simply listened to the world trying to tear itself apart. Ethan's hands stung with cold, his body ached, but the flood of adrenaline was finally ebbing. He looked at the bobcat, his accidental companion in the storm, and felt a strange mix of pride and terror. He'd broken every rule, gambled with his life and hers, and yet, in the ruins of the valley, beneath the judgment of the rain, he'd chosen compassion over protocol. And as the storm howled on, Ethan wondered, would the wild forgive him for stepping across the line? Or had he set something in motion that couldn't be undone? The storm outside the pine shelter rattled the forest, hurling sheets of rain against bark and stone. Ethan's clothes clung to his body, every movement scraping him raw with cold. But his focus stayed sharp, anchored on the wildcat just a few feet away. He watched her, barely daring to breathe, as she lay curled in the faint shelter, her sides rising and falling with shallow breaths, her wounded paw stretched awkwardly before her. Every so often, lightning flashed through the tangled branches, illuminating her sleek fur, the glint of water clinging to each strand. She looked small now, so much smaller than she had when he'd first seen her riding the flood's fury. In the flicker of light, Ethan could see the shivers that ran through her frame, the fatigue pulling at her bones. He wanted to look away, to give her space, but the pull of her suffering and his role in her fate was impossible to ignore. He kept his hands visible and his movements slow. "Easy, girl," he murmured, voice low and steady. "It's just you and me. We're riding this out together, like it or not." She didn't answer, of course, but something in the way she looked at him had changed. The wild suspicion in her golden eyes had softened, just a hair. Maybe she was too tired to be afraid, or maybe some deep animal sense recognized his intentions. Either way, the barrier between them, so rigid just minutes before, now felt thinner, like a pane of ice ready to crack. Thunder rolled again. Ethan dug into his field pack, pulling out a small canteen and an energy bar. He took a sip first, then poured a little water into the cap and slid it slowly across the mossy ground, never taking his eyes from the bobcat. She stared at the cap, nostrils flaring, then lifted her head. One trembling step, then another. For a moment, Ethan's breath caught. What if she turned on him now, felt cornered and lashed out? But she didn't. She only lapped at the water, rough tongue flicking, eyes flicking up to meet his with every swallow. He offered a crumb of the bar, more out of hope than reason. She ignored it, but Ethan smiled, relief softening the tension in his shoulders. "Yeah, I figured you'd hold out for something fresher. Maybe next time." For a long while they listened to the storm together, united by need and the strange, shared quiet of survival. Harper, he decided then and there that was her name, Harper, for the wild notes she'd sounded in the chaos, rested her head on her paws, gaze never straying far from Ethan. He watched her chest rise and fall, and felt something inside him loosen. Hours passed. The storm's wrath faded to a steady drizzle. Every sound in the woods sharpened, the drip of water from the needles, the occasional distant crash of a falling branch, the whisper of the river still running wild below. Ethan finally edged closer, whispering, "Let's see that paw again, huh?" He reached out slowly, his hands trembling, not from fear but from the weight of what this moment meant. Harper's ears twitched, but she didn't bolt. Instead, she shifted, offering him the wounded paw with a wary, almost resigned flick of her tail. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage, his breath catching at the sight of the angry red gash. Dried blood and grit had mixed with the fur. Harper winced as he gently cleaned it with water from his canteen, but she did not pull away. Ethan worked in silence, fingers nimble and sure, driven by a mix of duty and awe. He dabbed the wound, reapplied ointment, and bound it tightly. All the while, Harper's eyes were locked on his, unblinking, full of questions he'd never be able to answer. In that hush beneath the trees, something shifted. Ethan felt it, deep and real, a fragile, wordless trust blooming between them, as fleeting as the break in the clouds. The wildcat could have torn him open in a heartbeat. Instead, she let him help. There was awe in that, and humility, and the flicker of hope he hadn't dared feel in years. When he finished, Ethan sat back on his heels, watching Harper flex her paw. She looked at him, then looked away, the wild still in her gaze but tempered now by something else. He let out a long, slow breath, feeling both drained and grateful. "You're tougher than you look, Harper," he said, voice rough. "But you don't have to do it alone tonight." Suddenly, a branch cracked in the darkness. Harper's ears flattened, and Ethan tensed, ready for anything. But it was only the storm finishing its business, dropping another limb into the mud. He relaxed, settling in beside his wild companion, and watched the world outside slowly right itself. Somewhere in the night, the rain eased, and the first thin streaks of dawn crept into the sky. Ethan glanced at Harper, now sleeping at last, her breathing steady, her head nestled on her good paw. The sense of connection, the gift of her trust, was more powerful than any rescue or act of heroism. In that quiet moment, he understood something profound. Survival wasn't just about fighting the flood or mending wounds. Sometimes it was about letting your guard down, about meeting fear with understanding, about letting yourself be changed by the wild hearts you encountered along the way. As the sun broke over the horizon, painting gold across the battered landscape, Ethan reached out and gently touched the soft fur on Harper's shoulder. A silent promise. For as long as she needed him, he would be there. And for this single, extraordinary night, the boundary between man and wildcat had faded, replaced by the fragile power of silent understanding. Night pressed hard against the pine shelter, the storm's violence finally ebbing into a quiet, steady rain that pattered softly on the needles above. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth, moss, and wildness. Under the battered trunk, Ethan sat cross-legged, back pressed against rough bark, every muscle exhausted but wired with adrenaline. He pulled his damp ranger jacket tighter around his shoulders and checked once more on Harper. She was barely more than a shadow in the half-light, curled with her bandaged paw tucked close. Each rise and fall of her chest was a quiet victory, proof that, at least for tonight, she was alive. Ethan found his gaze lingering on her, watching the way her whiskers twitched in sleep, the flicker of her ears at every unfamiliar sound. Out here, in the deep woods with only a wildcat for company, the rest of the world felt impossibly far away. Wind rattled the branches, making the shelter shiver. Ethan shuddered too, feeling the cold in his bones, but he was grateful for the small refuge. He'd built shelters before, on solo hikes, in snowstorms. Once for a lost child, he'd found wandering the trails. But never like this, with the raw edge of fear and awe simmering in his gut. Never with a wild thing depending on him for survival. A fresh wave of rain swept through, sending droplets cascading down from the branches. Harper woke with a start, her eyes wide and wild in the darkness. For a moment, she seemed ready to bolt. Muscles tensed, hackles raised, the ancient call of flight surging through her. Ethan held his breath, fighting the urge to reach out, to soothe her as he would a frightened dog. Instead, he simply murmured, "It's all right. We're safe here. The storm's moving on." Harper stared at him, nostrils flaring. Then, after a long, silent moment, she relaxed, her body sagging into the moss again. It wasn't trust, not exactly, but it was something close. A recognition, perhaps, that for now, neither of them was the enemy. Ethan unzipped his backpack and dug for supplies. He found a battered flashlight, clicked it on, and swept its yellow beam around the shelter. The world outside was a wet blur, river swollen and mean, trees battered, the path home washed away. He checked his cell phone. No signal. The nearest ranger station was miles off, and the radio battery had died sometime before midnight. For tonight, the world had shrunk to this tiny circle of light and life, a fragile bubble in the storm. Hunger gnawed at him. He broke off a chunk of jerky and chewed slowly, offering another piece to Harper. She sniffed at it, hesitated, then accepted it with a reluctant swipe of her tongue. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, like building a bridge one trembling stone at a time. Through the long hours, Ethan tended Harper's wound, cleaned it with bottled water, replaced the bandage. She endured it all with wary resignation, flinching at every touch, but never striking out. In the quiet stretches between storms, he spoke softly to her, telling her stories from his own life. The way his father had taught him to respect the wild. The time he'd watched a cougar cross the road at dawn. The first time he'd held a newborn fawn in his hands. Sometimes Harper listened. Sometimes she turned her head away, her gaze fixed on some memory of the woods she'd left behind. But the shelter felt less lonely with her there, each of them drawing comfort from the other's presence. Outside, a coyote yipped in the distance, joined by the echoing cry of an owl. Ethan listened, heart thrumming in the hush, feeling as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Sleep came in uneasy snatches. Ethan drifted in and out, waking to the sound of Harper shifting in the darkness, the wind rattling the pine needles, the endless music of rain. Once he dreamed of water, endless, rising water, and woke gasping, hands clutching for purchase on the muddy ground. Harper watched him, eyes glowing in the gloom, and for a moment he felt as if she understood. In the deepest part of the night, the rain stopped. The world went still. Ethan listened to the quiet, the drip, drip, drip of water from the trees, the soft rasp of Harper's breath. He thought about the line he'd crossed to save her, the risk, the rule-breaking, the possibility that he'd made things worse instead of better. But as dawn's first pale light crept into the shelter, he knew, deep down, he wouldn't have changed a thing. Sunrise was slow and gentle, filtering through the battered canopy in golden shafts. Harper lifted her head, blinking against the light, her pupils shrinking to slits. She sniffed the air, testing the world for danger, then limped to the edge of the shelter and looked out. The river was still swollen, but the worst had passed. The forest gleamed, scrubbed clean by the night. Ethan watched her, his heart heavy with hope and worry. He knew what came next, knew that soon someone would have to help her heal, that her future in the wild hung by a thread. But for this one fragile morning, they were both survivors, bound by the storm, by the quiet empathy of two lives thrown together, by the simple, stubborn need to keep going. The sun climbed higher. Harper looked back at Ethan one last time, her eyes bright with something like gratitude, then lay down again, spent but alive. Ethan smiled, wiped mud from his cheek, and whispered, "Hang in there, girl. We made it through the night. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're still here." And in that gentle hush, as the day began, The shelter under the pines became a memory neither of them would ever forget. A flicker of hope, lit in the wild. Morning in the valley arrived in slow, golden layers. Sunlight crept between battered branches, touching the storm-wrecked earth with shy fingers. The air was cool, almost sweet, filled with the smell of wet pine, moss, and distant river. Under the shelter of the old pine, Ethan stirred, stiff from a night spent half awake. His whole body ached, shoulders knotted from tension, knees muddy and raw. But something lighter had taken root inside him. Maybe it was hope, or maybe just relief. Either way, it felt new. He watched Harper as she awoke, her lean form stretching beneath the feeble warmth of morning. She blinked slowly, nostrils flaring as she tested the breeze. For a long minute, the wildcat sat completely still, golden eyes taking in every ripple of sunlight and shadow, every scent and sound. She was battered, yes, her bandaged paw awkward and sore, but there was something proud in her posture, a survivor's grace. Ethan let her be, just watching, letting the moment breathe. The woods felt sacred in the hush after the storm, and he remembered, suddenly, the way his father used to bring him to places like this. Long before ranger uniforms and radio calls, there had been early mornings at the edge of some nameless meadow, his dad's rough voice low in his ear. Pay attention. Nature always gives a warning, a lesson, if you know how to look. It had seemed mysterious then, almost magical. The idea that the world was full of silent signals, invisible lines between wild and tame. He found himself whispering, almost without thinking, "See, Dad, I remembered, even when it's hard." His words drifted away, swallowed by the hush of the forest, but the memory lingered. Harper hobbled to her feet and limped toward the sunlight, her injured paw barely touching the ground. She moved slowly, but with determination, as if the pain itself was an old, familiar companion. She paused at the edge of the shelter, her body half in shadow, half ablaze with gold. She looked back at Ethan, her eyes bright with a complicated mix of wariness and something else. Gratitude, maybe, or just the acknowledgement of a shared battle. For a moment, time held its breath. Man and wildcat, bound not by words, but by the raw, unspoken understanding that comes from surviving something relentless together. Ethan felt the urge to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew better. Respect meant letting her decide, letting her shape her own next step. The river below was calmer now, its surface glassy and deceptive. From their vantage point, Ethan could see debris caught on rocks, branches, bits of fence, a child's lost boot, the aftermath of chaos. But also, a world picking itself up, piece by fragile piece. He turned his attention back to Harper and realized she was watching the river, too. Her gaze followed the currents, the wild, ever-changing lines of water and light. For a wild animal, the world was always in flux. Danger could come from any direction, and safety was never a guarantee. Yet she stood there, alert but unbowed, her wild eyes scanning the world with a sort of dignified resilience. Ethan's own memories flooded back, his father's stories about respecting the wild, the countless hours spent learning animal tracks, listening to bird calls, reading the signs, left in mud and snow. Back then, it had felt like a kind of secret language, a promise that if you paid close enough attention, you could learn to move through the world with humility and care. And now, here he was, living that lesson with every breath. He rose and walked to stand near Harper, careful to give her space. He knelt and let the sun warm his face. "You did it, Harper," he said softly. You made it through the flood. You're stronger than most of us ever get a chance to be. As if in answer, Harper lifted her head and met his gaze. There was no fear there now, only a flicker of something deeper. Recognition, maybe even respect. She studied him, whiskers trembling, and Ethan felt a surge of emotion so sudden he had to look away. The forest was waking up. Jays squabbled overhead. A squirrel darted along a fallen log, and somewhere far off, the sound of a woodpecker echoed like a steady drumbeat. Life, irrepressible and persistent, even after disaster. Ethan reached into his pack and found his father's old pocket knife, worn and silvered with age. He turned it over in his hand, the metal cool against his palm. He thought about the legacy his father had left him. Not just tools or lessons, but a way of seeing the world. The wild's not here for us to fix, his father had said. It's here to remind us who we are. He closed his eyes, let that wisdom settle into his bones, then looked back at Harper. She had moved a few steps farther, testing her strength, limping but unbroken. At the edge of the sun-dappled clearing, she stopped and looked back one last time. Their eyes met, a silent, unspoken thank you passing between them, something raw and sacred and real. Ethan's heart tightened. He wanted to say so much, to apologize for the suffering, to explain why he'd broken the rules, to promise that he'd always respect the wild's boundaries from now on. But in the end, he just watched as Harper slipped quietly into the woods, her form merging with shadow and light, the wild claiming her again. He stood in the hush, listening to the wind in the trees, the river's song, and the beat of his own heart. He felt the roots of his own life running deep into the land, shaped by family, by hard choices, by the quiet grace of a wildcat's trust. And as the morning unfurled, Ethan knew he'd never forget this encounter. Not just for the rescue or the risk, but for the way it had reminded him what truly mattered: respect, humility, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, a single act of care could ripple out into the world and change it for the better. It's funny how quickly the world can change, how a crisis gives way to aftermath before you even know you've caught your breath. As the morning stretched on, the battered forest slowly returned to life, sunlight glinting off the dripping leaves and painting everything gold. Ethan stood in the clearing, the memory of Harper's wild eyes lingering in his mind. But the work wasn't over. She needed more than kindness and luck. She needed real help. Ethan knew he couldn't let Harper try to heal on her own, not with that paw. He knelt where she'd last lain, studied the blood and fur caught in the moss, and quietly promised, "We're not done yet, girl. I won't let you go without a fight." He found her trail easily, paw prints pressed deep in the softened ground, each one marked by a slight drag where she favored her injury. He followed, careful not to spook her, moving slow as the woods whispered around him. It didn't take long before he found her, resting in a thicket at the edge of the clearing. Harper tensed when he approached, but didn't run. Maybe she was too tired, or maybe something had shifted between them in the night. Ethan spoke softly, crouched low, and offered her a piece of jerky as a peace offering. "Come on, girl, one more gamble. Let's get you some real help." He pulled out his cell phone, hoping for a signal. Just one bar, enough for a call. He dialed the local wildlife rehab center, breath tight with hope and urgency. "It's Ethan Bailey. I've got a wounded adult bobcat just north of the floodplain. She's alive, but her paw's bad. I need pickup as soon as possible." Dr. Grace Simmons answered. Her voice was calm, steady, familiar. She'd grown up in these mountains, her family caring for wild creatures for generations. "Hang tight, Ethan. We'll send a team. Keep her close, but safe." It wasn't long before the rumble of a rescue truck echoed through the trees. Two volunteers, both bundled against the chill, approached with gentle hands and practiced calm. They brought a large animal carrier, blankets, and a quiet confidence Ethan envied. Harper tensed at the strangers, hissing, but Ethan knelt beside her, his presence a bridge between wild fear and human help. With patience and a bit of luck, they eased her into the carrier. The moment the door clicked shut, Ethan felt a complicated rush of relief and loss. Dr. Simmons met them at the rehab center, a low-slung, cedar-shingled building that smelled of hay, iodine, and hope. Inside, the world was different, crisp and clean, with rows of enclosures and a steady hum of activity. Here, the wild and the wounded got a fighting chance. Grace moved with quiet authority. She examined Harper's paw, her hands gentle but unflinching. "It's deep, but she's strong," she said, cleaning the wound and stitching it with swift, practiced motions. Ethan hovered nearby, anxious and out of place, but Grace shot him a reassuring smile. "You did right, bringing her in. Sometimes compassion is the bravest choice." Word of the rescue traveled fast, faster than Ethan expected. One of the volunteers had filmed a few moments of the flood and the Bobcat's rescue on their phone. Before lunch, the video was already online, racing across social media. Ethan's inbox exploded with messages. Friends, fellow rangers, news outlets, even strangers from across the country. Some cheered him on, calling him a hero. Others questioned his decision. Was it right to intervene, or should he have let nature run its course? The flood of opinions surprised Ethan. One minute he was a ranger acting on instinct. The next, he was the center of a debate about humanity's place in nature. The video showed him, soaked, shivering, cradling Harper against his chest, the river roaring behind. In the comments, people argued, "He saved a life. You can't interfere with the wild." That's what real compassion looks like. "He overstepped. She's not a pet." There were heated discussions on local forums, and a segment ran on the evening news. Ethan tried not to let it all in, but he couldn't help reading. Pride warred with doubt. He remembered his father's warnings about doing too much, about respecting the wild's right to struggle and survive on its own. And yet, looking through the window into Harper's recovery room, seeing her awake, wary but alive, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. Grace checked on him as he lingered in the hallway. "You know, Ethan," she said, "we walk a fine line, all of us. Sometimes you let go, sometimes you step in. The world changes either way. What matters is you act with respect and love." That night, alone in his apartment, Ethan watched the rescue video again. He saw himself as others did, tired, desperate, determined, but he also saw the fear in Harper's eyes, the trust that had flickered to life between them. He wondered what people online would think if they knew the truth. The long night in the pine shelter, the small moments of grace, the weight of that wordless trust. The next morning, Ethan drove back to the center. Harper was awake, her bandage clean, her eyes bright with that wild, untamable spark. Grace greeted him at the door. "She's healing well. If all goes right, she'll be strong enough to return home in a few weeks." Ethan reached out and touched the mesh of Harper's enclosure, smiling as she blinked at him from the other side. The public might argue forever, but here, in this quiet moment, there was no debate. Only a bond forged in storm and struggle, and the simple, stubborn will to survive. He turned and left, letting the door swing quietly behind him. Out in the bright post-storm sunlight, the world seemed new. Harper would heal, the wild would endure, and Ethan, caught somewhere between pride and humility, knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is act with both courage and care, letting the world see what it means to truly respect the wild. The days passed quietly in the small rehab center tucked at the edge of the Montana forest. As the storm-wrecked valley slowly returned to life, so did Harper. Under Dr. Grace Simmons's careful watch, the Bobcat's wounds healed, her bandaged paw gradually regaining strength. For the first few days, Harper was a ghost in her enclosure, sleeping curled tight, eyes wary and silent as moonlit snow. But little by little, she changed. Ethan visited as often as his ranger duties allowed. He brought the calm, patient presence that had helped Harper survive that night in the woods. Sometimes he just sat nearby, reading reports or drinking coffee, letting Harper get used to his voice. Sometimes he spoke to her quietly, telling stories about other animals he'd known, or about the river that nearly claimed them both. Harper never answered, of course. But as the days slipped by, she came to expect his visits, sometimes lifting her head when she heard his footsteps, sometimes blinking slowly in a way that almost looked like a greeting. It was not trust, exactly. Not in the way a dog might trust, or even a house cat. But it was a kind of acceptance, a truce between her world and his. Simmons updated Ethan on Harper's progress. She's healing well. Appetite's good. She's regaining muscle. She's still wild, though. Keeps her distance from the staff. Won't let us touch her more than necessary. That's a good sign, honestly. Means she'll do well when she's released. Grace smiled. You made a difference, Ethan. I hope you know that. Despite the pride swelling in his chest, Ethan also felt a growing ache, a bittersweet tug he couldn't quite name. The more Harper improved, the closer came the day she'd leave. He knew what was right. He knew she belonged to the wild, to the tangled woods and high ridges, not to any fence or human hand. But the bond they'd formed in the storm, and through each careful, awkward encounter since, had changed him. When the day finally came, the air was bright and cold. The rehab center buzzed with quiet excitement. Grace and her team prepped the transport cage, lined with fresh straw, a last quick exam. Harper paced the length of her enclosure, as if she understood something important was about to happen. Ethan watched, his heart thumping with hope and sadness. "Ready?" Grace asked, her hand resting on his shoulder. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, let's give her the best shot." They drove out before sunrise, the rescue truck winding along muddy roads through the foothills. The land looked different after the storm, trees standing straighter, the river a little gentler, the scars of disaster softened by the returning green. They stopped at the edge of a dense pine grove, far from roads and towns, as wild and unspoiled as possible. Ethan and Grace worked together to set the carrier at the forest's edge. The moment was quiet, reverent. The only sounds were the distant chatter of a jay and the hush of the breeze through the needles. Ethan knelt beside the cage, meeting Harper's gaze one last time. Her eyes were wide, gold and alive, full of something he could only call recognition. He hesitated, feeling the weight of the bond they'd formed. It was a bond built not on ownership, but on respect, a rare, fleeting trust. "You're home, Harper," he whispered, his voice catching. "You're free." Grace opened the cage door. For a long moment, Harper didn't move. She stared into the trees, nose twitching, body tense and ready. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a single graceful leap, she was gone, vanishing into the undergrowth, her tawny form melting into the shadow and light of the wild. No backward glance, no lingering at the edge, just a single, perfect moment of freedom. Ethan stood, heart full and empty all at once. Grace watched him, her eyes kind. "You did good," she said softly. "Letting go, that's the hardest part." They packed up the carrier in silence, giving Harper as much space as possible, leaving only the faintest imprint on the land. As they drove back, Ethan watched the woods slip past his window, the sky softening from pink to blue. He found himself thinking of all the wild creatures he'd helped in his years as a ranger, the ones who made it and the ones who didn't. He thought of his father's lessons, the ancient truth that real love means letting go, that the wild can only be honored by setting it free. That night, back at his cabin, Ethan sat on the porch, the world washed clean by the rain. He listened to the hush of the forest and let the memory of Harper's release settle into him. He realized that what he felt most wasn't loss, but gratitude. The wildcat had trusted him, if only for a night, if only for a moment. And in that trust, she had given him a gift he'd carry forever. He poured himself a cup of coffee, watching the mist rise over the valley. He remembered Harper's eyes, the fierce, wary gold, the way she'd watched the world as if she belonged to it, and it to her. In that memory, he found peace. He whispered, as much to himself as to the wild world beyond his porch, "Be safe out there, Harper. May you run strong. May you never forget the wild in your blood." He knew he wouldn't forget her, or the lesson she'd taught him. That compassion sometimes means breaking the rules, that trust is the wildest thing of all, and that real love is unselfish. It lets go and wishes well. And somewhere out in the woods, a bobcat slipped silently through the trees, the dawn brightening around her, free at last. It's strange how one act, one wild, rule-breaking, deeply human moment, can send waves far beyond its original shore. The video of Ethan's rescue spread across Montana, and within days, across the country. In classrooms, offices, ranch kitchens, and coffee shops, people watched a ranger plunge into a flooded river to save a bobcat, and they saw something more than just a rescue. They saw a question, an old American question brought to life. How far should we go to help? Where is the line between compassion and control? It didn't take long for debate to bloom in every corner of the community. At the small elementary school in town, Mrs. Lopez played the video for her fourth graders. "What do you think?" she asked, as the kids watched Ethan's muddy, desperate struggle, his arms wrapped around the wildcat. Little hands shot up. Some said, "He's a hero." Others worried, "But isn't it dangerous to mess with wild animals?" One quiet boy raised his hand and said, "He did what he had to. He didn't think. He just acted." And in the hush that followed, Mrs. Lopez realized she'd started a conversation that would last the rest of the semester, about nature, bravery, and the blurry lines between right and wrong. At the weekly town meeting, the rescue was all anyone could talk about. The mayor, a sturdy woman named Trudy, opened the floor. "We're proud of Ranger Bailey, but let's remember, there's a reason for our rules." Some nodded in agreement, recalling past incidents where people had tried to help wildlife and only made things worse. Others spoke up in support, voices trembling with pride and conviction. "We need more people willing to risk something for another living soul, Even if it's not in the handbook, said Mr. Franklin, who ran the feed store and had once pulled a fawn from a barbed wire fence himself. The local paper ran an editorial, "When the Wild Calls for Help." Letters poured in, some praising Ethan's heart, others worried he'd set a dangerous precedent. Online, the story sparked fierce arguments, ecologists warning of the risk of human interference, animal lovers sharing stories of their own rescues, students and elders trading stories and folklore. Someone started a poll. Would you have saved the bobcat? The votes were nearly even. At the Wildlife Rehab Center, Grace Simmons found herself fielding calls from across the country. Other rangers wanted to know about protocols. Rehabbers asked about Harper's treatment. Reporters pressed for interviews. Grace handled each call with patience, always circling back to what mattered. It's about respect, for the animal, for the wild, and for each other. But something else began to happen too. Inspired by the story, more families volunteered at the center, kids spending weekends cleaning cages, learning to feed orphaned fawns and patch up injured owls. Teenagers started a Wild Friends Club at the high school, raising money for wildlife rescue and organizing litter cleanups along the river. Even the gruffest old-timers, the ones who usually grumbled about bleeding heart rangers, found themselves stopping by the center with donations or just to see how Harper was doing. The ripple effect reached even further. At a tribal council meeting on the reservation north of town, elders spoke about the old ways. Grandmother Walking Elk, who had watched the video with her grandchildren, reminded everyone of a teaching passed down for generations. Animals and humans are kin. What happens to one happens to all. To respect the wild is to respect ourselves. She told stories of ancient winters, when the people shared what little they had with hungry wolves, and how such acts, both risky and necessary, kept the world in balance. Her words lingered long after the meeting, echoing in the hearts of those who listened. Ethan found himself invited to speak at a community forum, a new experience for a man more at home in the woods than under fluorescent lights. He stood before a crowd of faces, teachers, ranchers, high schoolers, conservationists, tribal members. He spoke quietly, hands in his pockets, gaze steady. "I never set out to be a hero," he said. "I just saw an animal in trouble and something in me wouldn't let me walk away. I know I broke the rules. I know we have to be careful, and that nature's balance is delicate. But I also know that compassion matters, that sometimes, in a moment, you have to do what feels right, even if it's messy. That's what being part of a community means, human or wild." He told them about the night in the pine shelter, the fear and the hope, the way Harper had trusted him just enough to survive. He told them about his father's lessons, about humility and courage, and the power of acting with heart. The room was quiet when he finished. People left thoughtful, some still uncertain, but changed all the same. And as days turned to weeks, the story of the bobcat and the flood became more than just a local legend. It was a spark, reminding people that every act of care sends ripples through a community, that the line between help and harm is never clear-cut, and that sometimes it's worth risking a little chaos for the sake of kindness. Ethan went back to work, patrolling the wild lands he loved, but now he saw them through different eyes. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of change. A new volunteer at the animal shelter, kids rescuing a turtle from the road, neighbors stopping to help each other after a thunderstorm. And he knew that, for better or worse, his gamble on that stormy night had become a part of the valley's story. In quiet moments, he remembered Harper, not as a rescue or a lesson, but as a wild, living presence. He wondered how she was faring, whether she remembered the flood, the shelter, the soft hush of dawn. He hoped she ran strong, wild, and free, her trust a tiny thread running through the fabric of the land. And in homes and hearts all across Montana, people remembered too, sharing their own stories of unlikely bonds, hard choices, and the wild, beautiful risks of compassion. The seasons spun onward, painting the valley in new colors with each passing month. Summer's golden haze gave way to the brittle brilliance of autumn, the world crisp and expectant beneath the blue Montana sky. By the time another spring flood threatened the foothills, the valley had healed from last year's scars. But for Ethan Bailey, some memories lingered like echoes on the wind. One October morning, as the maples bled scarlet and the pines glimmered with frost, Ethan found himself pulled back to the place where it all began. His boots crunched over frost-tipped grass as he made his way down the old game trail, the river gleaming in the slanting sun. The air smelled of wet leaves and distant smoke. A year had passed, but in his mind, the storm was never far away. Ethan moved with a slower confidence these days, each step shaped by lessons learned and old wounds healed. He paused at the very spot where he'd first seen Harper, that unforgettable vision of tawny fur and desperate strength clinging to the storm-tossed log. Now the river ran smooth, its voice softer, gentler, a lullaby instead of a warning. He closed his eyes and let the memories come. The cold, the fear, the impossible gamble he'd taken that night. But with those memories came something else, an unexpected gratitude for the wild, unpredictable gifts life could offer. He crouched by the water's edge, watching a pair of mallards glide past, the current tugging gently at their feathers. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan pulled his father's old pocket knife from his coat, running his thumb over the worn engraving. The words, "Respect the wild," were nearly faded, but their meaning felt fresher than ever. He'd learned more from Harper in one night than from years of ranger training. He'd learned that true trust is not given easily, nor should it be. It is rare, precious, a brief, electrifying meeting between two worlds. He'd learned that real connection doesn't bind or possess. It lets go. It honors freedom. He'd learned that humility, not control, is the mark of a true steward of the land. As he stood, a sudden movement caught his eye. A flash of gold between the trees, quick and sure. Ethan froze, heart thudding. There, on the opposite bank, stood a bobcat. Powerful, lean, unmistakably wild. The morning sun set her fur ablaze, her eyes wide and unblinking. It was Harper. He knew it as surely as he knew his own heartbeat. For one breathtaking moment, their eyes met across the water. The connection was as real as it had been that stormy night, a silent understanding, born of fear, courage, and something close to love. Harper's gaze held his, proud and unafraid, her scarred paw a testament to their shared history. Ethan's breath caught. He wanted to call out, to reassure her, but he knew better. The gift she'd given him wasn't in her return. It was in her freedom, her wildness. The briefness of their reunion made it more powerful, a fleeting blessing that left him changed. Then, as silently as she'd appeared, Harper melted back into the forest, her form vanishing among the copper leaves. Ethan stood motionless, the moment settling into him like sunlight on stone. He felt a strange, fierce joy, a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. He realized, standing there, that the wild would always be wild, and that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone, or something you cared about, was to let it go, to trust in its ability to find its own way. The wild asks for respect, not possession. It asks for humility, for the courage to stand back, for the wisdom to let go when the time comes. He remembered the way his father used to talk about the land, about cycles and seasons, about the importance of leaving something untouched. You can only carry so much, Ethan. The rest, you leave for the wild? That's where the mystery lives. That's where you find your own heart. As he hiked back toward his truck, Ethan reflected on all the ways that storm and rescue had shaped him. He'd carried the story through a dozen town meetings and school assemblies, seen the ripple effect bloom across his community. He'd watched as more people volunteered, as respect for wildness grew, as even those who doubted him at first found themselves changed by the courage and vulnerability of one battered bobcat. It was never just about saving Harper. It was about learning the boundaries between help and harm, about understanding that not every fight is yours to finish, about honoring the brief, wild trust that changes you without warning. When he reached the edge of the valley, he turned one last time, scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, Harper lived on, hunting, resting, surviving on her own terms. Maybe she would have kittens this year. Maybe she'd grow old and wise, teaching other wild things to be careful, but also to be brave. Ethan smiled, feeling the autumn wind tangle in his hair. He understood now what it meant to be part of the wild without owning it. The river kept flowing, the forest kept growing, and every act of kindness, no matter how small, became part of the valley's story. He drove home with the windows down, letting the cool air fill the cab. He felt lighter than he had in years, unburdened by doubt. The wild had given him a gift, and he would spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of it. And if someday someone asked him what he'd learned from the bobcat and the flood, he'd answer simply, that true connection never binds. It frees. And in letting go, we find our own wild hearts. For a long time after that golden autumn morning, Ethan Bailey carried Harper's story with him like a talisman, a secret spark that lived behind his eyes and traveled with him on every winding trail. The world returned to its steady rhythm. Floods receded, summer faded to winter, and the small Montana town eased back into its routines. But for Ethan, and for many in the valley, something essential had shifted. One chilly November evening, Ethan found himself in the community center, sitting before a microphone in the softly lit room. A crowd gathered. Neighbors, teachers, kids, old ranchers, and new faces he didn't know. Some he'd seen at the wildlife center. Others had simply heard the story, felt its echo, and come to listen. The local station had set up a recording for a podcast, eager to capture the lesson everyone kept talking about. Ethan glanced at the familiar faces and then down at the old pocket knife in his palm, its inscription worn smooth by time. He cleared his throat, suddenly more nervous than he'd ever been facing a wild animal. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, he began. I didn't expect so many people to care about a story that started with a flood and a frightened bobcat, but maybe that's the point. These stories, they don't really belong to one person. They belong to all of us. He let the silence breathe, remembering the storm, the icy water, Harper's burning gaze as she made the choice to trust him for a single night. Some folks have called me a hero for what I did, Ethan continued, and some have said I went too far. I get both sides. The wild isn't something we're meant to control. It's bigger than us. But that night, well, I couldn't just stand by and watch her drown. I think, deep down, we all have moments where we feel that, when we just know we have to act, rules or no rules. He glanced at a young girl in the front row, her hand resting on a battered animal rescue t-shirt. He saw Mrs. Lopez, the teacher who had started her class, talking about the video. Grace, her gentle face shining with pride, and even grandmother walking elk, who nodded in encouragement. Ethan went on, his voice warming with the memory. I learned a lot from that bobcat. Not just about fear and survival, but about trust, about how thin the line is between helping and hurting. Sometimes all you can do is offer what you have, your courage, your patience, your respect, and hope it's enough. Harper taught me that real love isn't about keeping something close. It's about setting it free and wishing it well. He spoke of his father's lessons, of mornings learning to read the tracks in the mud and the importance of humility, of never thinking you own the wild. The wild, Ethan said, has a wisdom we forget too easily. It doesn't ask to be fixed or owned. It just wants to be honored. As he finished his story, he looked into the faces around him, seeing the same questions, the same wonder that had guided him that night. If you've ever been changed by a moment, by a wild encounter, or a bond you never expected, I hope you hold on to that. Share it. We need those stories, especially now. A gentle laugh rippled through the crowd. Someone called out, "So what happened to Harper?" Ethan smiled, picturing the bobcat slipping through the golden woods, as fierce and free as ever. "She made it," he replied. "I saw her again, just for a moment, but enough to know she was okay. The wild took her back. That's where she belongs." He ended the talk with a gentle, heartfelt invitation. If you're lucky enough to have a friend, animal or human, who trusts you without question, give them a hug tonight. Those moments don't come often, and they don't last forever. But they're what make life worth living. And if you have your own story, share it. With your family, with your class, or just with one person who needs to hear it. That's how we keep the spirit of respect and wonder alive. That's how we honor the wild, in others and in ourselves. Afterward, people lingered to talk, sharing stories of lost dogs, of eagles sighted above snowy ridges, of hard choices and wild chances taken. Grandmother walking elk told the tale of a wolf who saved her father in a snowstorm, and Mrs. Lopez's students lined up to ask questions about ranger work and bobcats. The room glowed with the warmth of connection, and Ethan felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. That night, walking home under a sweep of stars, Ethan paused at the edge of the woods. He listened to the hush, the owl's soft call, the wind in the pines, the old endless music of the wild. He knew he'd never really see the world the same way again. The wild was not a place on a map. It was a living, breathing presence, always near, always mysterious. In the quiet, he offered a silent thanks, to Harper, to his father, to every soul who'd shown him what it meant to trust and let go. He hoped the valley would remember, long after his own days were gone, that what matters most isn't the moment of rescue or the act of bravery, but the respect we give to every life that crosses our path. So if you're reading or listening, Ethan would want you to remember this. Don't wait for a flood or a crisis to reach out. Every day, there's a chance for kindness. Every day, the wild in the world and in us is asking for a little respect. If you feel the pull to help, don't turn away. Act with courage, act with humility, and trust that even the smallest ripple can change a life. And somewhere, far off in the moonlit woods, a bobcat moves quietly beneath the stars, untamed, unforgettable, and, for one extraordinary night, forever part of Ethan's story and the valley's heart.